All right, next I want to talk a little bit about the physical geography and natural resources of North America. And this is a figure from the book that tries to kind of divide it into different physical regions, like the Great Plains and the Pacific Mountains and valleys. I think I'm going to skip over this and just kind of look at some of the climate, look a little bit at the climate patterns and vegetation patterns of North America using some figures from a different textbook. This is showing the climate types, and essentially what you have is it's pretty wet down here in the east, can be pretty dry over here in the west, and then really cold up on top, up in Canada. And then something in between down here. And the vegetation patterns are somewhat similar. You have fairly, these are what we call biomes, or the type of vegetation that should occur naturally. We would tend to have forest in the eastern part of the United States, and also there's a big forest up here in Canada. We have, this is called the Great Plains, a big grassland here, which extends from the US up into Canada. You have deserts here in Nevada, Utah, and Arizona. And California is a little more complicated. We'll take a closer look at that in a moment. It has what's called a Mediterranean climate. And one feature I want to highlight here is this big forest up here called the Boreal Forest, Canada. This is a major geographic feature that covers a great deal of Canada, especially in the northern part of the country. So these are some of the great forests of the world. We have the Boreal Forest in Canada. And then over in Russia, we have the taiga. And the taiga is the largest continuous forest in the world. But the Boreal Forest is like that as well. It's these, let me show what these look like. Just vast, vast areas of trees that are adapted to these cold continental climates. And another type of climate is called a Mediterranean climate. And we highlighted this briefly in the first part in the physical geography lecture, but I want to highlight, where do you have it? Around the Mediterranean Sea, Australia, a little bit in Southern Africa, the country of Chile, we'll talk about that later, and also California. And Mediterranean climates are climates that have warm summers, dry summers. They're warm too, but Mediterranean climates have dry summers, which seems pretty natural to us, especially if you've grown up here, but not everywhere in the world has dry summers. Let's take a closer look. They really are kind of around the Central Valley, the Bay Area, LA, down a little bit into Baja, California. Here in the Central Valley, we're a little bit drier. We're considered more of a, what's called a grassland climate or a bee climate. But we still have the same pattern of having dry summers. Here in the, in the eastern part of the US, it's a lot wetter. It would be forested naturally. Here in the West, it would be a lot drier. So this kind of pink color, there's a lot of mountains in between, so you have some forests. And then you have kind of a big grassland with the Great Plains here. Now, one thing I want to highlight is this big dry area in the interior west of the United States. Why is that? Why is that so different than this wetter part of the eastern United States? And a lot of it has to do with mountains and something called the rain shadow effect. And the rain shadow effect is a phenomena because winds are blowing from the Pacific Ocean, because of the way winds circulate in the world. What you have is air coming from the Pacific Ocean, and as it rises over one side of the mountain, it creates wet conditions, but as it descends over the other side of the mountain, it creates dry conditions. So one thing about producing clouds and rainfall is when air is moving up, it's wet conditions. When air is moving down, it's called high pressure or dry conditions. And it has to do with the expansion of the air. It's the compression of the air, it's moving up, or expansion as it's moving downward. And so here's a kind of a model of California. If you may notice that if you go to the coast, if you go to Monterey, Santa Cruz, Pismo, it's a lot wetter, more, wetter conditions there. And that's because the wind is moving uphill along the Coast Range. And then it's a bit drier here in the valley, and that's why our climate is a little bit more dry. Then the pattern happens again with the Sierra Nevada, but the Sierra Nevada are much larger than the Coast Ranges. So you have this extremely wet side of the Sierra Nevada, the one that we see when we look at the mountains with the trees and all. But if you kind of make your way out to the Nevada side, then you have an extremely dry conditions. This is where we find places like Death Valley in the rain shadow of the Sierra Nevada. So if you look at a map of precipitation in the United States, and this would extend a bit into Canada, you have really a wet half in the east and a dry half in the west, except for the Sierra Nevada and the Coast Ranges and places like that. And a lot of that is because this big mountain barrier that sits and blocks the air that's coming in from the Pacific Ocean. And that has an impact on things like farming, that this is this dry area in the interior, you have more grazing land, sheep grazing, cattle grazing, because of the drier conditions. And then you have more of various other types of farming in the wetter parts of the east. This is a map showing crops in the United States. So the red areas are cropland where you have active farming going on. So it's pretty widespread in the Midwest and other parts of the east. Here it's really limited to the Central Valley and a few other valleys, but it's noticeably absent from large parts of the West. And also, it helps to explain some of the population patterns that we've seen. If you see the concentration of people more in the east, that's because there's wetter conditions and more habitable conditions for farming. And here in the interior west, you have a lot of deserts and mountains with small urban areas in between, like Salt Lake City, Las Vegas, Phoenix, and so on. This also impacts things even like the presence of public lands, that these deserts in the interior, a lot of those are owned by the US government. They're owned by the Bureau of Land Management or the Forest Service, because not a lot of people really, they weren't that farmable, so not a lot of people really tried to buy those lands from the government early on during settlement periods. Let's talk a little bit about natural resources in North America. This is a figure showing various things, such as coal and gas and oil. But I do want to just kind of highlight a couple things, like three kind of major things here. One is a natural resource called an aquifer. And one thing about the US and Canada is that an important natural resources are aquifers. And these are massive geologic formations that store water underground. It's sediment or rocks that water can flow through and water can be stored in. So underneath the ground, we have these massive things that hold water. Let's show that on the map. The color is just so you can kind of differentiate between the different aquifers. And these are some major aquifers in the United States. One we may be familiar with is the Central Valley Aquifer. So this is where our water comes from, the water we use on the tap for car washes, whatever else, is most of that is pumped from underground reservoirs called an aquifer. So here's a closer view of the Central Valley Aquifer. And so much of it would be replenished by water coming from the Sierra Nevada typically. We do have issues nowadays because so much of it is being pumped out for farming, and so much of the runoff from the Sierra Nevada is being diverted also for farming, that we're using our aquifer at a rate faster than it can be replenished. And so that's an issue in many parts of the country, and has become an issue in California as well. Right, so water is a big natural resource, and we're kind of fortunate in the, let me go back to this map, we're kind of fortunate in the US and Canada that most of the water, that our water supplies really originate within our continent. They don't really cross a lot of borders. Some countries that's not true, that a lot of their water resources actually originate in some other country and pass over a political border, and that kind of sometimes can hold them hostage because countries can build a dam and otherwise affect their water supply. That's less true for places like the United States because we kind of have our self-contained water resources, which is a real advantage. Another natural resource that has been, and even more important lately, has been oil and gas. And the United States always, at one time, it was the largest producer of oil, early on in the history of oil and gas. But it has become that again, that it kind of declined for a long period of time. But now the US, along with Saudi Arabia and Russia, we're among the top three. And sometimes we become the top oil producer depending on what's happening in the other countries. And the reason for that has to do with fracking. It's called hydraulic fracturing. And this is new technology that allows you to, where in the old days, someone would have to dip in and find a pool of oil and pump that out. What they're able to do now is actually use special technology to fracture rocks underneath the ground and kind of squeeze, let oil seep out of those rocks and extract it. And so this is a very high-tech type of oil production that's caused an increase in oil production in the United States to really bring us up to be one of the highest oil-producing countries in recent history. Now, Canada is not as big an oil producer as the US, but it is a significant. I think it's like number 20 in the world. But theirs is different, where the US is fracking or hydraulic fracturing. In Canada, their oil production comes from something called tar sands. And these are sands that are kind of these sticky sands that if they put them through the right kind of processes, they can extract oil from these sticky tar sands. So they have to kind of scrape out all these sands, and they have to go through a whole lot of processing to create oil. So the US, hydraulic fracturing or fracking, Canada, tar sands. And the big area of tar sands is actually also in the boreal forest. We talked about the big forest in Canada, and this is an area called the absence. I'm gonna blank, but this is the absence. I'm gonna not say right. Tar sands in Alberta, Canada.